What compelled you to write the book?
That's a real good question. So I had written two other books, and I was deeply involved in coverage of the Middle East, terrorism, counterterrorism, and I I was I had the last book I'd written before this was about ISIS, so it's really a lot that had to do with Syria and Iraq, and this seemed in a way to be kind of a sequel to that. It's a little bit of a mixed story because some of the timelines don't quite aren't sequential. But I was so interested in the subject that when I understood that there was this additional threat in Syria, not just the terrorist threat, but also this chemical weapons problem, on top of all the human rights atrocities that were going on. It just felt like a really good story to me. So I started kind of pulling threads. The way it works with nonfiction, with kind of journalism that I do, you start out on a subject that you think might be an interesting story, and then as you get deeper into it, you might find out that, well, maybe not so interesting, maybe not so exciting. But in this case, I really fell in love with the story, with characters, and with so the people, everybody who was involved in it, and also just my heart broke for for Syrian people, for the tragedy that they've suffered, and I wanted to have some way of being able to tell people about that and remind them that there's this terrible civil war that's been going on for 10 years now, and the broken families and the disrupted lives and destroyed cities are just it's just a great global tragedy, and people need to be reminded of it.
Hmm. And how long did it take for you to write it?
So the whole book was about 2.5 years, and that's seems like a long time, but for a book, it's actually not so long, especially if it's nonfiction, because that includes the reporting time too. So obviously, I had to do a lot of travel to the area, to the Middle East, but also to other places to interview some of the characters. This Swedish guy that you meet in the first part of the book, named Selstrom, he's the guy that went and investigated the chemical weapons attack that happened in 2013. I went to Sweden to see him, so I had to go spend time with him and get his story and talk to the people who were on the boat at Cape Ray. Got to see the boat and get on the boat and spend time with them. And so all those things took time. And the writing itself was probably about a year solid. And that again might seem like a long time, but it's not. It really is. It's because it's tough writing. It's not like writing a paper. You really have to try to make it interesting and lively, and to develop all the story as well as you need to. It just takes a lot of time. So yeah, about a year for the writing itself.
The next question, you kind of answered it so far, but how did you get the quotes?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, and I hope not everybody understands the process. So I'm glad you asked, because I think some people may have the idea that you make it up like a fiction writer would do, but every quote, every interview has to be documented and footnoted. So if you look at the back of the book, there are all these footnotes. So every time I quote somebody, you could go back and look at the sort of the footnote that corresponds to that quote and see where it came from. And so I'll describe who I talked to get that quote, and what the circumstances were. Sometimes somebody doesn't want to be quoted by name because they have a job where they can't be quoted, so I have to explain that. But for me, it was a very painstaking process of having to spend hours and hours and hours interviewing people. And again, the Swedish guy, Selstrom, I traveled all the way to Sweden to spend time with him. But that wasn't the only time we spoke. We spoke by phone, we spoke by text messages and WhatsApp. And so it was a dialogue that continued for weeks. And I spoke to probably 15, 20 members of his team to get different perspectives from people who work with him and who were there on the ground. So when I described a scene or tried to tell a story, I knew about it from so many different directions that I could describe it almost as though I was there myself. And that's when you feel like you've got a good handle on the material and you could do a good job with the part.
Wow, okay. Who was the intended audience when you were writing this book?
So I try to write my book so that lots of different people might be interested. If it's a serious scholarly book that's just for historians or people who are really into sort of the current events or the politics or the political struggles, then that's a different kind of book. I wanted to make it a kind of story that everybody might want to read, but I had in mind people who like spy stories, people who like the Middle East, people who like so to read about counterterrorism. I wanted to appeal to lots of different potential groups, and that's why I tried to make it a very broad story. So it's not just about one thing, but it gives you a real, almost a panorama, which means like a think of a movie camera kind of moving across a big field and capturing lots of different things in areas. So that was my intent, was to try to make it so that somebody maybe even as young as 11 might enjoy it, but certainly people who are in Washington, D.C. and really follow the events in that part of the world would want to read it too. And you're 11, right? Is that right? You're 12. Okay, that's awesome. You've done a lot for a young man.
Thank you. I have one question that's
Mm-hmm.
not directly like the other ones. So the opposition was directly referred as the rebels, correct?
Yeah.
So most of the points, especially in the beginning, not the prologue, but after the prologue, where Selstrom's team went in,
Mm-hmm.
like the opposition wasn't fully united.
Yeah.
They had their own like small pockets and have their own leaders fighting for their own thing, just like ISIS.
Yeah.
Why?
That's a very perceptive point, and not many people get that about Syria, even here in Washington, because there was an expectation that okay, well, there's this uprising against a corrupt leader, a dictator, so everybody's going to get together and fight against them, and we're going to win control of the country and maybe create a democracy or something that's a little better place to live. But what happened instead was that all these little groups popped up, and it's partly because the opposition was not very well organized. There are different factions that were kind of based on religious beliefs, and some were because of the tribe they happened to belong to, or the ethnic group. It was very, very scattered. And then onto this mix of different interest groups come these outsiders, terrorists sometimes, like ISIS and Al Qaeda, people with very different ideas about how they want Syria to be. And they came in with a lot of money and with a lot of guns and propaganda. They were able to talk people into joining their group. And so what started out to being this little patchwork of small groups ends up getting almost pushed aside by these bigger organizations that came in from the outside. And in the end, so the small groups almost disappeared or got sort of gobbled up by these bigger organizations. And that's kind of part of the tragedy of Syria, is that people started a revolution. They were real rebels in almost the American revolutionary sense, trying to fight for a better country. And in the end, they were defeated by other rebels who had different interests and didn't really want the same things that they did. And again, it's really part of the tragedy of the story, is that so this idea of being able to win a better life for yourself was completely lost and destroyed by people who had other objectives.
Wow. So, the counterterrorism campaign at the end of the book was mainly against ISIS. And was the person nicknamed the Controller ever captured?
We think so. And it has been really, that's something I really wrestled with as I was doing the book, because we were trying to figure out exactly what happened to him. And we heard with good authority that he was probably killed, but we don't know that for a fact. And that's the case for several of the sort of terrorist figures toward the end of the book, people who worked on the chemical weapons program. The intelligence community lost sight of them. So they think they might have been killed in a bombing or some other kind of raid. But it's very possible as well that they still exist. They still live somewhere in the world. And they may try to do this somewhere else. It may not be Syria, but it could be in another country, Europe even. And so that's part of the continuing danger, is the fact that these people still have bad ideas. They know how to make bad things, and they still exist, either those people themselves or people who train with them and know how to do the same kinds of things.
So, sort of like the Nazi Party after World War II.
Good analogy. So that you have some of the leaders are rounded up and killed. Others end up going to South America and starting new lives for themselves, and are influential in their own way. And today you see people who still like the Nazi cause for whatever terrible reason, So you could think of those people with these ideas that are scattered could still be dangerous because they're still trying to promote, a very dangerous way of living.
Well, thank you for answering my questions.
Well, really good questions, and again, you've been very, very thoughtful in the way you read the book. So, what do you want to do, Jaden? Do you know what you'd like to do when you grow up?
So, maybe a bit later in my life, probably like a World War historian. So,
Okay.
covering
So as a writer, or maybe like a filmmaker, or what do you think?
just how there's like town historians,
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
questions for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, kind of like that.
Oh, that's a great idea, and you're on a good path because you're sound like you're doing the right things, and your mom is helping you get networked and getting to meet a lot of people, which is super interesting too. But I'm just really delighted to meet you. My daughter, she's in her 20s, so she's much older, but when she saw your book review, she said he's going to be president. This guy, so she thinks. So she thinks she's got a big future ahead of you, but I know you'll do great whatever you do. All right, guys. So have fun hope it's a great weekend, and we'll be in touch. Let me know.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so
Take
much
care.
again.
All the
Bye.
best. Good weekend. Bye.